Welcome to Lecture 6, where we look at the breaking of the seven seals and an interlude where the servants of God receive a seal on their forehead, Revelation 6:1 through 8:5. Introduction to the seven seals. When we come to the seven seals in Revelation 6:1 through 17, picking up again in 8:1 through 5, with the first significant interlude in 7:1 through 17 of the book, we must be reminded how crucially important it is for us to view the visions of John as a complete tapestry. We must not separate them into individually isolated chunks and then try to correlate them with some extra textual event either in the 1st century or in the 21st century. We must consider all of the details in relation to the other details, and we must consider all the details and not pretend that when we ignore some of them to make the correlation fit, that we are rendering an interpretation of the text of the Apocalypse. The structure of John's text gives us clues to the meanings of his visions. They must be interpreted as part of a continuous tapestry. This will be even more important for next week's lesson when we consider the vision of the seven trumpets in 8:6 through 9:21, and the confluence of the commission of John in chapter 10 and the ministry of the two witnesses in chapter 11. The scene in heaven of the ecstatic symphonic worship shifts back to the scene of the Lamb with the scroll. There is a recognizable pattern in the seven seals, the 4+2, then interlude, +1 pattern. That is, the first four scenes are a unit, followed by two scenes, which are followed by an interlude which brings perspective on the ensuing drama before the final item of the septet. The four horsemen of the Apocalypse are called forward and wreak disaster on the earth, so that a quarter of the earth is killed by sword, famine, and pestilence, and by the wild animals of the earth, Revelation 6:8. The next two seals portray scenarios at the heart of the message of the Apocalypse, raising crucial questions about salvific vindication for the martyrs and revealing judgment for everyone who dwells on the earth. Two questions resound from the voices of these characters, and they will reverberate throughout the rest of the unfolding drama. In the immediate context, the scenes are of intensifying havoc, rushing toward what appears to be the final judgment. Seals 5 and 6 are followed by an interlude where God restrains destructive forces of the four winds so that angels can seal those who are designated as God's servants. The next two scenes juxtapose contrasting images of the people of God, similar to the manner in which the hero of the narrative arrived with the contrasting images of lion and lamb. This digression concludes with a poem that celebrates the blessed state of those who have been redeemed out of the great affliction or tribulation, Revelation 7:14. They are welcomed into the company of those who enjoy the presence of God and the shelter of the Lamb, and they find complete comfort for their distress on earth. It's only after the interlude that the Lamb opens the seventh seal. God, having separated the faithful and threatening those on earth, we might expect now for the culmination of divine judgment. However, that suspenseful anticipation is unsettled and diffused by what happens next. First, there is silence in heaven for half an hour. This is both surprising, as it seems to interrupt the perpetual singing of praise day and night, and soothing, as it allows for a moment of pause, and it halts the stampeding action toward final judgment. This pause creates space for reflection and opens the possibility for repentance for those who are threatened by the fierce prospect of God's coming. Furthermore, the next series of seven is introduced here with John seeing seven angels having been given seven trumpets. The setting of the altar, we think back to Revelation 6:9, takes precedence here in chapter 8 as an angel with a censer fills the censer, with fire from the altar and casts it down to the earth. This will help to draw our attention to a vantage point that spans the cosmos, viewing both heaven and earth to see how the two realms are interrelated. The action and the way it is often portrayed in a passive sense We often hear that something was given or was permitted, complicates the notion of divine agency throughout the apocalypse. We will see that it is the four living creatures surrounding the throne who call forth the four horsemen that bring devastation to the earth. Does this mean that God, or at least his entourage, is the cause for destruction and death on the earth? Does this indicate some kind of hard determinism? A sort of apocalyptic fatalism that requires that God be responsible for every action and event in both heaven and on earth? If the passive voice of many of the verbal constructions should be considered a divine passive, is God ultimately culpable for both good and evil? This latter inference does not seem likely as a legitimate aspect of the theology of Revelation and the manner in which God resists evil and overcomes the destroyers of the earth as the one who is the Creator. This theme will be explored in more detail when we discuss the intensifying desolation of the seven trumpets in chapters 8 and 9. Our broader theological consideration for this lesson will focus on the theme of the Great Tribulation as an apocalyptic discourse, which helps to frame the significance of the affliction through which the white-robed multitude is redeemed. For now, we will let it be sufficient to agree with Gregory Stevenson when he writes, "This connection between the first four seals and the throne room of God is not a declaration that God is the deliberate source of all war, famine, and death on earth, though it is certainly suggestive that God may utilize such for his own ends. Elsewhere, Revelation assigns the origins of much warfare, violence, and destruction to the dragon and its pawn, the beast. The theological point of Revelation 6, 1 through 8 is not causality, but control. If God is indeed on his throne and sovereign over his creation, as Revelation 4 through 5 assures, then he is sovereign over conquest, war, famine, and death, and can employ even these in service to his divine plan. Revelation does not allow for any limitation on God's sovereignty in his dealings with evil and suffering. According to Revelation's perspective, the reason God does not do away with suffering and opposition is not because he cannot. While I would want to avoid the language of God's control, because it too often connotes some kind of rigid, mechanistic determinism that makes God out to be some sort of divine puppeteer, I do fully concur with Stevenson's claim here about divine sovereignty. God is sovereign, and yet God does allow for contingencies within his creation that can tend toward obstinate corruption of God's creative order. This is certainly the case by many of the characters within the drama of Revelation. Therefore, before we consider the details of Revelation chapters 6, 1 through 8, 5, the sequence of the seven seals, we will briefly discuss the discourse of the Great Tribulation in Jewish apocalyptic texts as it relates to the transition of the ages. We've already seen that this is a feature of the sealed text of Daniel's apocalypse, where the angel tells Daniel of an extraordinary time of suffering that will come upon the people of Israel. It is also pervasively attested as a feature of many Second Temple Jewish texts, which help to establish a certain precedent for what the image would have conveyed to John's audience in Asia Minor. The images associated with the breaking of the first six seals overlap with the imagery of Jesus' Olivet Discourse that we hear in Mark 13, parallel with Matthew 24 and Luke 21, which describes events that accompany the birth pangs that signal the coming of the Son of Man with the clouds. The Great Tribulation as apocalyptic discourse. The prophetic tradition of Israel's scriptures often portrayed divine judgment in cataclysmic terms. This motif becomes focused in the apocalyptic tradition onto a particular time of cataclysmic upheaval, swelling right before the transition of the ages, that eschatological moment of transition where the new age is breaking forth from within the old age. As such, the period can be referred to as birth pangs, or, in later Christian tradition, a time of messianic woes. We will briefly discuss some of the key features of this discourse in order to understand more fully how this tradition influences the scenes of catastrophe in the book of Revelation. The tradition regarding a great tribulation seems to coalesce during the time of the Hellenistic crisis in Judah, spawned by the arrival of Alexander the Great and the spread of Hellenism in the wake of his coming. Alexander and the spread of Hellenism indelibly changed Judaism. More than this, the dynasties of Alexander's successors dramatically affected the lives of the Judeans. Particularly, the region of the Levant, that is from Syria in the north to the Arabian desert in the south, was tossed between two kingdoms, the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria and the Anatolian Peninsula. The region of the Levant was a strategic importance for both trade and travel between Mesopotamia and the areas to the west. It was the rule of the Seleucids in Syria that led to significant Hellenistic reforms, which in turn gave rise to the famous Maccabean revolt and set a trajectory for several Judean groups fracturing and fragmenting into varying interests. This, in turn, gave rise to much of the apocalyptic response in Second Temple Judaism. The Hellenistic crisis gave rise to many different responses among the Judeans. Some gladly acquiesced and embraced Hellenistic culture and the promises of prosperity and progress that it could bring. For example, the athletics of the gymnasium and the education of the Ephebion. Others resisted and even rebelled against the imposition of foreign customs that were perceived to threaten the distinctive identity of Judean covenantal faithfulness. These turbulent times were marked by controversy, both internally among the Judeans themselves and externally between Judeans and the foreigners. Aristocratic families fought with one another and postured themselves in alliance with the foreign rulers to gain position for their own. Families themselves were divided, and the priesthood became a commodity to be auctioned to the highest bidder. All of this made for instability and social anxiety and made the whole environment ripe for a catastrophic conflict. All of this is fascinating and complex, and the audience is invited to explore the literature mentioned here in the footnotes. However, for our purposes, we can focus on how all of this manifests in the book of Daniel and how the historical writings of the Maccabean literature, especially 1st and 2nd Maccabees, illuminates the events portrayed in Daniel's visions. A time of unprecedented distress in Daniel. We recall the book of Daniel in the last vision encounter includes a warning about a time of impending crisis linked to the promise for deliverance. It reads in Daniel 12:1, "At that time Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. There shall be a time of anguish, such as has never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book." In Daniel chapters 8 through 12, Daniel's given visions about the impending events that will occur with the arrival of the king of Greece, 8:21, who defeats the Median Persian rulers. It is explained to Daniel, who prays with confession and entreaty regarding Jeremiah's proclaimed 70 years of exile, that there will be 70 weeks in Daniel 9, verses 24 to 27. These 70 weeks are interpreted as 70 sevens, and more specifically as 70 times 7 years, or 490 years, under the influence of the Jubilee tradition of Leviticus chapters 25 to 26. This notion of an extended period of 70 carries through the apocalyptic tradition. What follows in Daniel chapters 10 through 12 brings the history of the exilic Judahites roughly up to the time of the Maccabean revolt. Daniel's visions, set during the Persian period, quickly move to the time of the Hellenistic period of Judah's history. Daniel details military campaigns waged by the Seleucid king Antiochus III against the Ptolemies at Raphia and the Panion, as well as his defeat by the Roman armies at Magnesia, which was the crucial exchange that led to Roman dominance of Asia Minor. There is mention of Antiochus' son, Seleucus IV, who sent his emissary to take money from the Jerusalem temple and perhaps to satisfy the heavy tribute that's now demanded by Rome, mentioned in Daniel 11:20. This incident is treated at some length in 2 Maccabees chapter 3, which records the affair along with the denunciation by the high priest Onias III, who is himself later betrayed by his brother Jason, who outbids him for the office of high priest. Onias III is later murdered, if we look at 2 Maccabees chapter 4, and most modern critical commentaries on Daniel perceive a reference to him, that is, Onias III, as the anointed one who is cut off in Daniel chapter 9, verses 26. The text of Daniel 11 shifts to the encounter with Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who is portrayed as unmitigatedly evil. First, it will be helpful to hear how the text of 1 Maccabees represents the events. Then we'll see how Daniel's apocalyptic vision portrays the same events. 1 Maccabees, a text that recounts the exploits of the Maccabees, a name that probably comes from the Aramaic word for hammer, indicating the ferocity with which they fought against the Hellenizing oppressors. 1 Maccabees is a history written to defend the legitimacy of the Hasmonean high priestly dynasty. The narrative begins with a summary about Alexander's success over the Persians and the Medes, on to his death, and then the mention of the division of his kingdom among his successors, the Diadochi. It reads like this: Then his officers began to rule, each in his own place. They all put on crowns after his death, and so did their descendants after them for many years, and they caused many evils on the earth. From them came forth a sinful root, Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus. He had been a hostage in Rome. He began to reign in 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. In those days, certain renegades came out from Israel and misled many, saying, Let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles around us, for since we separated from them, many disasters have come upon us. This proposal pleased them, and some of the people eagerly went to the king, who authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem, according to the Gentile custom, and removed the marks of circumcision, and abandoned the holy covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. That's 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 8 through 15. After this, Antiochus pursues several military campaigns against Ptolemy VI, who's ruler of Egypt. Several times Antiochus assaults the city of Jerusalem with violence, trampling and defiling the temple, plundering its sacred vessels, and committing grievous acts of violence against the inhabitants. He sells many into slavery, seizes livestock, and establishes a citadel in Jerusalem to secure his position. Antiochus continues with a policy aimed at eradicating Judean distinctiveness. Again, in 1 Maccabees now 1, starting with verse 41. Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. He added, And whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. In such words he wrote to his whole kingdom. He appointed inspectors over all the people and commanded the towns of Judah to offer sacrifice, town by town. Many of the people, everyone who forsook the law, joined them, and they did evil in the land. They drove Israel into hiding in every place of refuge they had. We pause with the narration of 1 Maccabees to take account of Daniel's portrayal of these events. We will make annotations regarding the historical events. So now starting in Daniel chapter 11, picking up with verse 20. Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an official for the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he shall be broken, though not in anger or in battle. This refers to the Heliodorus affair. Again, thinking to 2 Maccabees chapter 3. In his place shall arise a contemptible person, that is, Antiochus IV, on whom royal majesty had not been conferred. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom through intrigue. Armies shall be utterly swept away and broken before him, and the prince of the covenant as well, that is, Onias III, who was replaced by his brother Jason, because Jason outbid him in paying bribes to Antiochus. And after an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully and become strong with a small party. Remember the certain renegades of 1 Maccabees 1:11. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province and do what none of his predecessors had ever done, lavishing plunder, spoil, and wealth on them. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. He shall stir up his power and determination against the king of the south, that is, Ptolemy IV, with a great army, and the great king of the south shall wage war with a much greater and stronger army. But he shall not succeed, for plots shall be devised against him by those who eat of royal rations. They shall break him, his army shall be swept away, and many shall fall slain. The two kings, their minds bent on evil, shall sit at one table and exchange lies. That is, Antiochus IV and Ptolemy VI form an alliance and conspire to kill the co-regent there in Egypt, Ptolemy VIII. But it shall not succeed, for there remains an end at the appointed time. He shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. He shall work his will and return to his own land. We remember the plunder described in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 21 to 24. At the time appointed he, that is Antiochus IV, shall return and come into the south, but this time it shall not be as it was before, for ships of the Kittim, that is, the Romans, shall come against him, and he shall lose heart and withdraw. He shall be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay heed to those who forsook the holy covenant. Shift back briefly to the historical narrative of 1 Maccabees for a description of the terrorism unleashed on the Judeans. Verses 54 to 64 read, Now on the 15th day of Chislev, on the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah and offered incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. The books of the law that they found they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant or anyone who adhered to the law was condemned to death by decree of the king. They kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the towns. On the 25th day of the month they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of burnt offering. According to the decree, they put death to the women who had their children circumcised, and their families, and those who circumcised them. They hung the infants from their mothers' necks. But many in Israel stood firm, and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. Think to what Daniel 11, verses 32 through 35 say. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food or to profane the holy covenant, and they did die. Very great wrath came upon Israel. These gruesome details correspond precisely to the narration of the visions in Daniel. Daniel, like Revelation, uses the structural approach of recapitulation, where similar scenes are depicted from various angles. We will see the scenes from Daniel chapters 8, 9, and then return to chapter 11 again with annotated commentary. First chapter 8, starting with verse 9. Out of one of them, that is the horns that grew out of the one horn on the head of the male goat, which is the four successors, those four horns refer to the four successors to Alexander the Great. Out of that came another horn, a little one, that is, Antiochus IV, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It was as high as the host of heaven. It threw down to the earth some of the host and some of the stars, and trampled on them. Even against the prince of the host it acted arrogantly. It took the regular burnt offering away from him, and overthrew the place of his sanctuary. Because of wickedness, the host was given over to it with regular burnt offering. It cast truth to the ground and kept prospering in what it did. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one that spoke, For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate? And so here we need to look not just at this passage, but also Daniel 9:27 and 11:31. The Hebrew here is shikutz shomem, which is a derogatory pun on the expression Baal Shamein, which means Lord of Heaven, and this was an epithet of Olympian Zeus as it was used in Syria. So there's a play on this word, a negative pun. The text goes on, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled. And he answered him, so in response to the question of how long, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I tried to understand it. Then someone appeared standing before me, having the appearance of a man, and I heard a human voice by the Ulai River, calling, Gabriel, help this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I became frightened and fell prostrate. But he said to me, Understand, O mortal, that the vision is for the time of the end. As he was speaking to me, I fell into a trance, face to the ground, and he touched me and set me on my feet. He said, Listen, and I will tell you what will take place later in the period of wrath, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. The male goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between its eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which four others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. At the end of their rule, when the transgressions have reached their full measure, a king of bold countenance shall arise, skilled in intrigue. He shall grow strong in power, shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does. He shall succeed the powerful and the people of the holy ones. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall be great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and shall even rise up against the prince of princes. But he shall be broken, and not by human hands. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. As for you, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. Now from Daniel chapter 9. 70 weeks are decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand, from the time that the world went out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the time of an anointed prince. This probably refers to Joshua the high priest, who leads with Zerubbabel. We can look at Zechariah chapter 4, also Ezra 2:2 and 3:2, and Haggai 1, verses 1 through 14. The text of Daniel goes on, There shall be 7 weeks, and for 62 weeks it shall be built again with streets and moat, but in a troubled time. After the 62 weeks, an anointed one, probably now Onias III, shall be cut off and have nothing, and the troops of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. He He shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half a week he shall make sacrifice and offering cease, and in their place shall be an abomination that desolates. Note above when we talked about that Hebrew pawn in Daniel 8:13, until the decreed end is poured out upon the desolator. And now finally, Daniel chapter 11. Forces sent by him shall occupy and profane the temple and fortress. They shall abolish the regular burnt offering and set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with intrigue those who violate the covenant, but the people who are loyal to their God shall stand firm and take action. The wise among the people shall give understanding to many. For some days, however, they shall fall by sword and flame, and suffer captivity and plunder. When they fall victim, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join them insincerely. Some of the wise shall fall, so that they may be refined, purified, and cleansed, until the time of the end, for there is still an interval until the time appointed. The king shall act as he pleases. He shall exalt himself and consider himself greater than any god, and shall speak horrendous things against the God of gods. He shall prosper until the period of wrath is completed, for what is determined shall be done. He shall pay no respect to the gods of his ancestors, or to the one beloved by women. He shall pay no respect to any god, for he shall consider himself greater than all. Remember, Antiochus Epiphanes, the nickname Epiphanes means something like the manifestation of the gods. So in the title, you can hear the arrogance. He shall honor the god of fortresses instead of these, a god whom his ancestors did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses by the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him he shall make more wealthy, and shall appoint them as rulers over many, and shall distribute the land for a price. All of this helps us understand how the text of Daniel relates to the horrendous events that transpired under the violent and blasphemous Antiochus Epiphanes IV. First Maccabees, remember, it summarizes, very great wrath came upon Israel, in chapter 1, verse 64. Remember, Daniel is told, there shall be a time of anguish such as has never occurred since nations first came into existence. In light of the whole narrative apocalypse of the book of Daniel, this time of anguish is a recurring motif associated with the latter days and the appointed hour. Stephanos Michalios, who traces this motif throughout the text of Daniel, explains, the eschatological hour in Daniel 8 through 12 is a time of persecution for the people of God, caused by God's final adversary. This hour depicts an eschatological era, since it involves the end-time battle that will take place between God's adversary and the people of God. Thus, it initiates the eschaton as it is revealed in Daniel chapter 8, 17 and 19, 10, 14, 11, 35, and verse 40 and 45, and 12, 1. The hour of 12:1 also refers to the judicial representation of God's people, which resembles the court imagery of Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 to 14, with the Son of Man possibly representing the people of God. It is within this final period, the hour, that the kingdom of God will also be given to the saints. In conclusion, the hour of Daniel 12:1 can be summarized as such. In God's final hour, suffering is integral for deliverance to take place, a deliverance through judgment and resurrection. Steve Moyes comments on how this language from the text of Daniel, coupled with other resonances from Exodus, is taken up in an act of imitation in the Apocalypse, in a climactic image of judgment in Revelation 16, verses 17 through 21. Moyes suggests the possibility of an intensifying sequence of biblical progression. He writes, the phrase is used to emphasize the severity of the Egyptian plagues from Exodus 9:18, 10:6, 11:6, and is picked up again in Daniel 12:1, a time of anguish such has never occurred since nations first came into existence. It's used to describe eschatological judgment. Perhaps we are supposed to recognize a sequence here. In Exodus, it is the worst calamity since the founding of Egypt. In Daniel, it's the worst since the founding of any nation. In Revelation, it's the worst since there was a human being on earth. The text in Daniel represents a view that the time before the final vindication will be marked by unprecedented suffering. God's people will experience this affliction or tribulation before they experience the salvific vindication that comes from God. This same sequence is reproduced in several apocalyptic texts throughout and beyond the Second Temple period. We will briefly survey some of these texts and the manner in which they express the motif of a looming great tribulation. Tribulation as a sign of the turn of the ages. Dale Allison begins his description of the apocalyptic discourse of a great tribulation in this way. Many of the ancient Jewish texts that foretell the end of the present world order also announce the coming of a great tribulation, a final time of trouble that is the mark of a transition between this age and the age to come. The stereotyped descriptions of this catastrophic period, which culminates in the final judgment, are well known. Before the redemption, there will be earthquakes. Famine will ravage the land. Wars will wage. Friends will turn against one another. There will be signs in the heavens. The regular recurrence of these and similar portents in the literature is striking. The many descriptions of the final terror and tribulation are very close indeed. Yet this must not lead one to suppose that the expectation of a final catastrophe was strictly well defined. On the contrary, a critical review of the relevant material reveals a variety of interpretations. Thus, the idea of a great tribulation heralding the eschatological age was flexible, and different writers have bent it in their own interests. Allison goes on to discuss various aspects of the attested ideas. The Great Tribulation may be represented as presently occurring or as a future event. Furthermore, the texts vary with regard to portraying who exactly will suffer in this period. Is it the saints or God's elect, or is it the wicked? In his comprehensive study on the preservation and redemption of the remnant of true Israel, Mark Elliott summarizes his conclusions about what he deems a destructive preservation pattern of salvation. He writes, "The continuation of Israel in some form, even after judgment, offered the opportunity to have vindicated the special teachings or way of the group. It's a feature of these various Second Temple Jewish writings, as determined in the review of their eschatology above, that Israel would eventually acknowledge that the righteous were correct all along, even openly honoring them. Since Israel was the larger unit, the larger society, over against which these groups defined themselves, since the rest of Israel was the group they argued with and protested against, and since Israel shared with these groups similar claims on a common inheritance, it can be seen how a fuller restoration would grant to the cause of the remnant groups an especially satisfying and ultimate vindication." All this means that history past and history still to come, possessed a very practical importance for these groups. Rather, they hope to be vindicated in and through their history, even more importantly, vindicated by those Israelites whom they surpassed in their striving for righteousness. It would appear, therefore, that the restoration, in the particular way it was conceived by these groups, was to constitute the ultimate experience of vindication within history. The faithful remnant of the present, having perceived an unprecedented degree of apostasy in the nation, and having voiced its protest against the present state of things in Israel, firmly believed that its message of protest and teachings about true righteousness would eventually be vindicated, not only by the Gentiles, but especially, even more significantly, by the elect nation itself, as it honored the remnant and eventually joined their cause. In this way, the nation of Israel would finally fulfill her calling, and the pious Israel would then be able to make sense of all the distress, persecution, and apostasy they were facing. Finally, in his brilliant and wide-ranging study, Brant Pitre, in Jesus, the Tribulation, and the End of Exile, notes that the expectation of messianic tribulation can be found in a diverse range of various genres of Jewish literature from the Second Temple period. It's present in historical apocalypses, heavenly visions, hymnic literature, psalms, oracles, pesharim, rewritten Bible, sectarian community rules, and various fragmentary pieces whose genre it is no longer possible to determine. From his extensive survey of the literature, Pitre catalogs several major aspects of the discourse of tribulation in Second Temple Jewish writings, listed from most to least frequent. 1. The tribulation is tied to the restoration of Israel and the end of the exile. Remember that 70-year period that gets extended in Daniel. Secondly, a righteous remnant arises during the tribulation. Third, the righteous suffer and or die during the tribulation. Thus, this sometimes includes the suffering and or death of some kind of messianic figure. Next, the tribulation is tied to the coming of a Messiah, sometimes referred to as the Son of Man. Next, the tribulation precedes the final judgment. The tribulation is depicted as the eschatological climax of Israel's exilic sufferings, often through the imagery of the Deuteronomic covenant curses. We think to Deuteronomy 28. Next, the tribulation has two stages. 1, a preliminary stage, and 2, the Great Tribulation. Next, the tribulation precedes the coming of an eschatological kingdom, and an eschatological tyrant, opponent, or anti-Messiah arises during the tribulation. Also, typological images from the Old Testament are used to depict the tribulation. Also, the tribulation is tied to the ingathering or conversion of the Gentiles. The Jerusalem temple is defiled and or destroyed during the tribulation. And finally, the tribulation precedes the resurrection of the dead and or a new creation. These recognizable features show up not just across different kinds of textual genres, but also among various Judean groups. Among the writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls, these expectations seem to have amalgamated into an anticipation for a coming eschatological war, where the righteous community members, the sons of light, would charge into battle against the enemies of God, the sons of darkness, and they would attain decisive victory to purge the land and then usher in restoration. These burgeoning military expectations and the need to steel oneself and one's community expanded well beyond the Qumran Covenanters. The effects of such expectations were poignantly on display in the tragedy of the Judean War with the Romans that resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The vision of an end within history was not exclusive to Judean writings alone. Similar sentiments were expressed in Greek and Roman literature as a response to the ravishings of war and the devastations of clashings of cultures. Therefore, there's a broad network of associations that would have provided a key intertext for John's audience to understand the significance of the images of tribulation, both as an experience of suffering of the righteous and as an instrument of judgment and discipline upon a rebellious world. Jesus' Olivet Discourse as apocalyptic. Jesus himself also employs the apocalyptic discourse of a great tribulation as he lays out the eschatological events which he refers to as the beginning of the birth pangs, Mark 13:8. In this prophetic forecast, Jesus offers warnings, exhortations, and descriptions of cosmic portents while he is poised on the Mount of Olives. Thus, it is often called the Olivet Discourse, sometimes the Little Apocalypse. The Olivet, the Mount of Olives, sits across the east side of the Jerusalem temple across the Kidron Valley. Jesus predicts the coming of wars and rumors of wars, the coming of false messiahs and false prophets, earthquakes and famines. It will be a time of betrayal by kin, persecutions, violence, and imprisonments. In these times, Jesus warns that the most vulnerable will be the more susceptible. He says, "Woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing infants in those days." He also exhorts his disciples to be alert and stay awake, and specifically invokes the language of Daniel's unprecedented tribulation. Jesus says, "In those days there will be suffering such as not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now. No, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he has cut short those days." What is more, Jesus uses the apocalyptic language of cosmic dissolution. "But in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven. The powers in heaven will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds, with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven." This would appear, by superficial glance, to be a description of the very end, not just the end of an age or of an era, but the end of the space-time existence. How could anything remain if the sun becomes dark, the moon no longer shines, and stars fall from heaven? Furthermore, if this describes the coming of the Son of Man, then certainly that would seem to indicate the end, right? However, the narrative context of all these words of Jesus makes the issue much more complicated. For those who read this text as words referring simply and plainly to the end of time and a still coming future termination of the space-time universe, there's often little recognition that all of this forecasting of signs of the end comes as Jesus' response to a question from his disciples. If we look back to the previously surrounding literary context, we notice that there is a precisely specific situation and location for this whole discussion. The chapter in Mark opens this way. "As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, 'Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings.' Then Jesus asked him, 'Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down.'" Thus, when Jesus and his disciples are leaving the temple, which occurs after Jesus has performed his disruptive temple action in Mark 11, and he has engaged in confrontational dialogue with chief priests, scribes, Sadducees, Pharisees, and Herodians, and others, look at Mark 11:27 through 12:44, Jesus and his disciples exit the grand temple complex. His disciples marvel at the magnificent beauty of the temple and all surrounding facilities. Jesus makes plain what he had predicted in the street theater of his dramatic sign act in the temple action. The temple will be destroyed. This, of course, is precisely what did happen in the tragic conflict between the Judeans and the Romans in the wars of 66 to 73. The city of Jerusalem was besieged, the city burnt in vengeful rage, and the temple was razed to the ground by the Roman legions in 70 of the Common Era. This was a cataclysmic event imbued with cosmic significance. The Judeans had lost the center of their universe. In order to understand the significance of this loss, we need to understand that the temple was not just the loss of some impressive buildings and the disruption of some cultural activities that organized religious and social life. The temple was the axis mundi, the center of Israel's world, the very palace where God's special presence was manifested. John Levinson, in his brilliant introduction to the Hebrew Bible, writes, "The temple is not a place in the world, but the world in essence. It is the theology of creation rendered in architecture and glyptic craftsmanship. In the temple, God relates simultaneously to the entire cosmos, for the temple is a microcosm of which the world itself is the macrocosm." To lose the temple for the Judeans was for them to have their world completely come apart. The world without the temple is a return to the formless and void of Genesis 1:2. Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down, Jesus says. And so, when his disciples have had time to process this startling revelation, once they've arrived across the ravine to the rows of olive groves across from the temple, the conversation resumes. When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray." Therefore, Jesus' whole Olivet discourse is a response to the disciples' question about when the destruction of the temple and the throwing down of its stones will take place. Everything Jesus says in Mark 13, framed by this narrative dialogue and located in this setting, relates to the tumultuous times that were quickly approaching. Even the terrifying images of cosmic dissolution, that is, the darkening of the sun and moon, the falling of the stars, and the shaking of powers in heaven, all this is stock apocalyptic imagery that expresses the catastrophic trauma of the devastation leveled against Jerusalem and its temple. Luke's version follows Mark's quite closely. However, the impact of the prediction of the destruction of the temple in Luke's gospel is heightened because Luke records a poignant scene when Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, weeping over the city and prophesying about the coming of a violent siege. Luke tells us that as he came near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, "If you, even you, had only recognized on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. Indeed, the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up ramparts around you and surround you and hem you in on every side. They will crush you to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave within you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation." The Olivet Discourse is more complicated in Matthew's version. The question on the disciples' lips is expanded. Matthew's Gospel reads this way: "When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign of your coming, of the end of the age?'" So, it's common to see two separate questions here in Matthew's Gospel among the commentators. R.T. France is typical when he construes the disciples' question as combining two aspects of the future, the predicted destruction of the temple and Jesus' parousia, as the end of the age. With regard to the former, the question is when. With regard to the latter, what will be the sign? The former question is in focus in the first part of the discourse. The latter is its later sections. France understands Jesus to be making a distinction, even a temporal distinction, between the two time periods. Others, such as W.D. Davies and Dale Allison, who write the International Critical Commentary on Matthew, resist the temporal dichotomy and argue that Jesus' words in Matthew's version combine past, present, and future in a depiction of the entire post-Easter period, interpreted in terms of the messianic woes. Now, this is not the place to adjudicate interpretive controversies about Matthew or Mark. What is important for our purposes is to recognize that the images about to ensue in association with the breaking of the seven seals in Revelation correspond and overlap significantly with the images of catastrophe associated with Jesus' prediction of the destruction of the temple as an eschatological event, and possibly another level of end-time fulfillment in the parousia, that is, the royal coming of the Son of Man at the end of the age. It is now a common practice to chart the similarities in images and themes. Even a casual glance impresses upon one that the material seems to refer to the traditions of anticipations regarding the same eschatological events. And so here is a chart that is comparing Revelation 6, 1 through 8, 5, that is the seven seals, with the Olivet Discourse in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so we can see that there's a lot of similarities there in colors, showing we've got the wars of conquest, violent conflict, we have famines, violence, again in Revelation, persecutions. Different orders there, it's a little bit, but we can see Luke adds disease, but all of them have heavenly signs. But it's quite distinctive when we look to compare how Revelation concludes with in respect to the way that the Synoptic Gospels conclude. We see that social and cosmic upheaval was to mark the culmination of history and the ways of expressing that became stereotyped over time. However, this tradition was reinterpreted by the early Jesus movement, who perceived the events around Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection as the inbreaking of eschatological events into their present time. The manner in which Mark overlays the language of the Olivet Discourse with his portrayal of the Passion narrative indicates that the events of Jesus' sufferings and the events surrounding the calamitous destruction of Jerusalem's temple were intertwined. Again, a chart will assist us in the comparisons. So we note in comparing Mark 13 with the Passion narrative in Mark 14 and 15, talk of in both the destruction of the temple, warnings that the disciples will be delivered up to Judean and Roman authorities, and that's exactly what happens to Jesus. Jesus warns the disciples will be betrayed by kin, and Jesus is betrayed by Judas, an insider. The sun will be darkened, Jesus says, and while Jesus is on the cross, darkness covers the land. Jesus says the Son of Man will be seen to be coming in the clouds with great power. And Jesus says this very thing during his trial. Jesus warns no one knows the hour, but at the end when they're at Gethsemane and he's about to be arrested, he warns them the hour has come. In both cases, he tells them to watch, but as the disciples are sleepy and groggy in Gethsemane, they fail. Jesus warns in a parable of sorts that the master comes, beware that he comes so he doesn't find you sleeping. And that's exactly what happens with Jesus and his disciples in Gethsemane. And finally, we notice in that parable the language there and the temporal markers. Jesus warns, therefore keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or in morning. And those are the precise temporal designators used throughout the Passion narrative. The most compelling correspondence in this chart is the use of the temporal designators drawn from Jesus' proverbial parable about a man who goes on a journey and leaves slaves in charge of his home, the slaves who wait in anticipation of his return. Dale Allison remarks, both the Passion narrative and Mark 13 accordingly announce that the present and coming tribulation will eventuate in the advent of the Son of Man. Turning our attention back to the Apocalypse, we can be reminded that John already sees himself as experiencing the affliction or the tribulation, remember the Greek, the thlipsis, of the faithful eschatological witness. In the message of the risen Jesus to Philadelphia, Jesus warned, because you've kept my word of patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming upon the whole world to test the inhabitants of the earth. Therefore, we can concur with Greg Beale as he writes, the tribulation has begun with Jesus' own suffering and shed blood, and all who follow him must likewise suffer through it. This corporate identification of suffering believers with Jesus is expressed especially by the phrase fellow partakers in the tribulation and endurance in Jesus that John uses in Revelation 1:9. The tribulation has begun in the present and will be intensified in its severity at the end of history. The scenarios envisioned as the seven seals are broken will provoke the memory of the stereotyped tropes associated with the Great Tribulation. John will employ the topos, but only to reconfigure it and exploit the ambiguities in the ongoing march of history and the delay of final divine intervention. The first four seals, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, Revelation chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. The first four seals are clearly marked as a unit. They have a similar pattern. In each case, the Lamb opens the seal. Then one of the four living creatures calls out, "Come," erchou in Greek, and a colored horse with a rider appears. The appearance of the four riders all results in devastation upon 1/4 of the earth, with death resulting from sword, famine, pestilence, and wild animals in 6:8. Each of these four horsemen call into question the Roman imperial propaganda, beginning with Augustus Caesar, that Rome had accomplished a global security and peace through its conquest and establishment of law. There is also significant biblical resonance in these images. They recall especially the horse chariot patrols of the book of Zechariah in chapter 6 and also at the beginning in chapter 1. These vision reports themselves are amalgamations from previous prophetic predecessors. Mark Boda displays how Zechariah 1, 7 through 6:15 is a coherent unit, unified by a common structure and similar themes. There's a symmetry between the initial horse vision of 1, verses 8 through 15, and the latter vision of the horses with chariots in chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. They are equally structured with emphases on different colors distinguishing the horses. The focus of the first horse vision is on comfort in the face of the evidence that God sovereignly patrols the earth. This represents God's attentive watch over the whole earth and sovereign involvement in the affairs of all nations. There's development in the second horse vision with the accompaniment of the chariots, indicating that there is now a mission to exact punishment on the land of the north, that is, Babylon, who had destroyed Judah's first temple. Carroll and Eric Myers explain the development in these terms. The presence of the chariots in the vision brings about a shift in the symbolic function of the four mounted emissaries of chapter 1. Riding in the night and among the myrtles, those horsemen of chapter 1, verses 8 through 11, represent a divine intelligent service as such that conveys the idea of Yahweh's omniscience. The chariots of chapter 6 contributes a new dimension to the global imagery, that of divine omnipotence. The chariot was the vehicle associated with political sovereignty. Chariotry clearly represents the ultimate or absolute sovereignty of a political entity that can forcibly carry out its policies and exercise dominion. Even the non-military appearances of the chariot in ancient Near Eastern literature and art bear out this meaning. The chariot appears ceremonially in processions or in the hunt. The four chariots thus add the concept of divine omnipotence to the idea of divine omniscience established in the opening vision. God's presence in all the world is composed of his knowledge of all that transpires, on the one hand, and his control over all that happens, on the other. The combined conceptualization of the two components of divine omnipresence dominates the opening and closing units of Zechariah's temple visions. In the final vision, the might of the earthly empires is transcended by divine power. It is these resonances of divine omniscience and divine omnipotence that get carried through in the illusion of Zechariah's horse visions with the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Greg Beale explains the rhetorical function of the disasters in these terms. Therefore, the horses in Revelation 6, 1 through 8 signify that the natural and political disasters throughout the world are caused by Christ in order to judge unbelievers who persecute Christians and in order to vindicate his people. Believers need to understand the dual role of these calamities so that they can accept them in a positive manner as tools of sanctification yet also realizing that these same trials are punishments upon unbelievers. While I find Beale's use of the strong language of Christ causing these natural and political disasters to lack theological nuance in the manner in which the apocalypse conveys divine agency, which we will discuss next week, I do concur that the rhetorical function aims at both inducing repentance of those who are rebellious and compromising, and comfort for those who remain faithful in the midst of the calamitous events as history marches on. Therefore, I find Kester's articulation of the matter more satisfying. Kester writes, "Theologically, Revelation works with attention. The threats represented by the horsemen are not directly imposed by God, and yet seem subject to God. The seal visions do not explain why there is suffering. In the worldview of the apocalypse, multiple forces are at work. Ultimate authority belongs to God, but the forces of evil, which are in rebellion against God, also operate in the world. People cannot always tell whether a threat comes from God, from Satan, or from human sin. Instead of offering explanations, the visions of Revelation 6 address readers as a form of proclamation. They are designed to unsettle complacent readers, reminding them that the present order will not continue forever. At the same time, the visions give the oppressed incentive to persevere with confidence that the veneer of peace which enables those with influence to threaten them will be taken away. Now we can briefly take account of the visions of the seven seals. A white horse, conquest. With the first seal comes a white horse representing conquest. Notably, the horse has a bow in his hand, not a sword, therefore unlikely to be the same rider on the white horse that we see later in Revelation 19, who has a sword coming out of his mouth. This has signaled to many interpreters that the bowman rider would have evoked the imagery of Eastern warriors, and specifically the Parthians, who were known to ride white horses and brandish bows and arrows. Auni comments, "The bow was not, however, a Roman weapon, but one widely used in Greece, Anatolia, and the Near East, especially Parthia." Kester rightly warns against specifying the image here with solely a Parthian connotation, but the resonance of the Parthians and how they were connected to the legends of Nero's return will be explored further when we discuss Revelation chapters 13 and 19. This may tie into the wider scope here of challenging the hegemony of Roman imperial claims to have secured peace throughout the entire world. This would be akin to a political cartoon today depicting soldiers, but perhaps brandishing some kind of symbolism that indicated they were a force threatening the presumptuous claims of a certain nation or ideology to be invincible. American culture is ambivalent about soldiers. On the one hand, they are some of our most revered heroes, even icons of virtue and courage. On the other hand, if we were to perceive in the image of a soldier an enemy force, we are quick to demonize them, their intentions and activities. The image of conquest here in the first writer is also ambivalent. On the one hand, Rome celebrated its conquests as divinely mandated. On the other hand, the rebellious subjects and insurrectionist threats imperiled the fragile order. Kester's summary is particularly insightful. The first writer challenges the perception of invincibility that was integral to imperial propaganda. Revelation warns that the present order is not inviolable, and that those who compromise their faith to accommodate it are trying to placate powers that are not supreme. Fiery red horse, war. The second horse issues the threat of war, coming on a fiery red horse, the same color as the dragon in Revelation 12:3. It is permitted to take peace from the earth so that people would slaughter one another. This one was given a great sword. The writer raises the prospect of violence within the reader's own society, thus countering the idea that the world was securely at peace under Roman rule. The word for slaughter, sfadzo in 6:4, is the same word used to describe both the lamb in 5:6 and the martyrs under the altar in 6:9. This connection indicates that the slaughtering of the lamb and the faithful witnesses is an extension of the broader phenomenon of violence and suffering in God's creation. On the flip side, this indicates that the lambs and the witnesses' solidarity with those who are suffering in the world. Blount explains the image in these terms. The term slaughter indicates horrific carnage. Here it refers to global holocaust. Later, John declares that those who kill with the sword shall likewise themselves be killed by the sword in 13:10. The second writer uses his weapon to set the tragic circumstances in motion. The Romans who used the sword to create their self-interested peace now find the sword being used to cut them down and shred their serenity to bits. The irony is eschatologically delicious. They not only receive the justice they deserve, their own symbolic tool of pitiless oppression is used to deliver it. Black horse, famine. The third rider comes on a black horse representing famine. He holds a pair of scales, and a voice from in the midst of the four living creatures calls out, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, but do not damage the olive oil and the wine." A denarius was a whole day's wage for the common worker. This plague will affect both commerce and basic sustenance. A quart of wheat was the typical amount for one person, and barley was more typically used by the poorer classes. Auni explains, this statement suggests an exorbitant price for basic commodities during a period of famine caused either by drought or by war, about 8 times the normal price for wheat and 5 1/3 times the normal price for barley, and indicates the relative value of wheat and barley. Kester, on the other hand, suggests that the inflation rates may have been much higher, but with the same basic result. The prices in Revelation were 8 to 16 times higher than usual, rates associated with severe shortages. A worker would have to spend his entire day's wage to provide wheat bread for himself or enough barley for a small family. Kester explains that the emperor oversaw Rome's grain supply and appointed special officials to administer it. Since the time of Augustus, the empire was presented as one large household, with the emperor as the head of the household, the pater familias. The ability to regulate and sustain provisions was a crucial administrative function of the empire's success in convincing the provinces of Rome's beneficent rule. Food shortages put a damaging strain on the empire's reputation and its ability to maintain social cohesion. Yarbrough Collins remarks that Revelation shares in the perspective of social unrest in Asia Minor, especially as a result of economic inequity, as we noted in our first lecture. Marvin Pate suggests that General Titus's ransacking of the city of Jerusalem during the Judean War serves as the backdrop for this image, just as it does for Jesus' Olivet Discourse. Titus practiced a scorched earth policy, but ordered that the olive trees for oil and vineyards for wine be spared. The language of Josephus describing the Judeans scrounging for food during the siege of Jerusalem has an eerily similar feeling. He writes, "Many there were indeed who sold what they had for 1 measure. It was of wheat, if they were the richer sort, but of barley, if they were poorer." David de Silva describes the situation in broader terms of the consequences of Rome's self-indulgent economy. He writes, "Several ancient observers comment on the conspicuous consumption and ostentatious display that characterize Rome and Roman elites, substantiating John's accusations of Rome's intemperate luxury. Global trade with this ultimate luxuriating consumer brought several significant economic consequences. First, such trade allowed local provincials to increase their wealth and thereby their status. A second consequence is inflation, or deprivation in the provinces where the goods are produced. Although Rome purchased the grain inexpensively, With money supplied in part from the tribute of client states, the residents of the provinces where this grain was produced often paid high prices for their grain. And in times of shortage, they went without. This was exacerbated by local landowners' interest in producing crops that brought in a better financial yield per arable acre. Market demands made the production of oil and wine far more attractive, often leading to scarcity in the essentials of wheat and barley in the provinces. Revelation chapter 6, verses 5 through 6, reflects a situation in which the prices of staples are grossly inflated, while production of oil and wine proceeds unabated. John calls attention to the parasitic side of the Roman imperial economy. Therefore, so far, a 3-for-3 indictment of the status quo in Roman social, political, and economic practice, these horsemen are exposing the exalted claims and overblown hype of the Pax Romana as deceitful propaganda. The divine judgment here is an unveiling and exposing of Roman violence, exploitation, and structural injustice. The fourth horseman is the inevitable culmination of imperial policies. A pale green horse, death, and Hades followed with him. The final horseman, called by the fourth living creature, is identified as a personified death, and Hades, the place of the dead, is personified with him. We should note two things. First, their power is immense, but limited. They are able to affect 1/4 of the earth. Second, the range of instruments by which they wield their power is broad, by sword, famine, pestilence, and wild animals. The list of ways in which death can be inflicted undercuts the reader's sense of immunity, making death's power seem inescapable. The image recalls God's punishment of Israel in Ezekiel chapter 5, verses 16 and 17, using the same images, which in turn recalls the curses enforced upon broken covenant in Deuteronomy 28. With this language, the first four seals are bound together as a unit, portraying the precarious vulnerability of world events and exposing the sham of imperial powers to overcome them. The next seals, crucial reverberating questions of salvation and judgment. The visions of the next two seals are of a different order. They're bound together by the questions that are asked, which will become thematic motifs for the rest of the first vision cycle as well as for the second one. Both questions raise the stakes for what is involved in the differing allegiances in light of the sovereignty of God's throne and the surety of God's plan for the outcome of history. The first question is posed by the voice of the slaughtered witnesses under the altar. The second question is raised by all the inhabitants of the earth at the manifestation of portents indicating the coming of God and the Lamb. Both these questions receive different kinds of answers, responding to different levels of meaning. The following interlude serves to give more definite answers to the questions, but they also thereby become more complicated. The fifth seal, Martyrs under the altar, Revelation 6, 9 through 11. With the breaking of the fifth seal, John sees the lives of those who have been slaughtered for the word of God and for the testimony they had given. As mentioned above, the use of the same verb for slaughtered for the lamb in 5:6 and the unspecified victims in chapter 6 verse 4 indicates both a solidarity with victims of violence, but even more so an extension of the victory of the lamb. That is, the lamb is portrayed as redefining victory and conquest by being slaughtered. Therefore, the violence enacted against these witnesses is a continuation and perpetuation of the lamb's victory through the earth. These victims have simply followed the pattern of the lamb. The connotation of the word slaughter takes on sacrificial overtones in the context of the mention of the altar. And yet, this does not mean that either the lamb or the witnesses take on the character of sadistic or masochistic lovers of pain. Self-sacrifice does not entail here self-loathing or indiscriminate self-harm. In fact, the picture is quite the opposite. The first question comes from the voice of the slaughtered martyrs echoing the question of the seer of Zechariah's vision in chapter 1, verse 12 of the book of Zechariah, which echoes the prayer of Daniel in Daniel chapter 9 as he read the predictions of the 70-year exile in Jeremiah. In a loud voice, the voice of the lives under the altar in Revelation 6 cry out, "Sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long will it be before you judge and avenge our blood on the inhabitants of the earth?" How long? That's the first question. This is the cry for justice in the midst of an unjust and unwarranted execution. This is the cry for rectification and vengeance. Gregory Stevenson avers, "The cry for justice and vengeance is the cry of all who have experienced atrocities, both great and small, throughout the world. Their plea is an acknowledgement that true justice sometimes requires vengeance, not the petty revenge born of resentment or selfish desires or hurt feelings, but the divine vengeance that acts to bring order out of chaos and to set right what has gone horribly wrong." The martyr's location at the altar bears several possible significances. Commentators debate whether this altar refers to the altar of burnt offerings, where the ritual blood sacrifice is conducted, or the altar of incense, which symbolizes the prayers of the worshippers. Kester claims that Revelation does not distinguish between the two, but conflates them into a single altar. Resegwe notes that the mention of the altar here in 6:9 is the first of 8 references to the altar in Revelation. Furthermore, Resegwe claims in 6:9 the altar is a place of refuge for those who lost their lives because of their faithful witness to God. It is the heavenly counterpart to the earthly wilderness. Both are in between spaces of the martyred souls who await the resurrection from the dead, and for the saints who journey through the wilderness to the new promised land. The church is always at the nexus of the penultimate until the coming again of Christ and the arrival of the bride city, the New Jerusalem. Stevenson agrees with the significance of refuge, but claims that this is a reference not to the altar of the Jerusalem temple, it did not function in this way, but rather to the function of the sacred altar of asylum in Greek religious practice. Stevenson suggests 3 ideas as integral to the practice of appealing to the altar as a place of asylum. First, there is protection. The supplicant comes under the protection of the deity to whom the altar is dedicated. The second concept is justice. The gods could adjudicate fairly in the affairs of mortals. The third concept is wrath. Fear of divine retribution, one would hope, would function alongside piety and reverence for the altar to deter violation of the sanctity. The response to the cry of the witnesses is twofold. First, we are told that they are each given a white robe. Second, they are given a preliminary answer to their question, a little longer. How long must they wait until divine justice is executed upon those who killed them? Just a little longer. But there is more. They must wait a little longer until the rest of those witnesses who are to be executed are included in their number. The response to the martyrs under the altar is really threefold. First, they are given the provisional answer of a little longer. Next, as we shall see in the interlude, the answer comes in the form of a vision that exhibits what the faithful martyrs will receive as a reward. Precisely, inclusion into the company of the heavenly court, comfort directly from God, and enclosure in the fold of the Lamb's flock. Finally, the answer comes not in a precise clarification as to how long the suffering must last, but rather insight into the divine plan regarding the reasons why God delays in executing justice. Resegwe expresses the theological significance thusly. The divine answer to their question acknowledges suffering in the plan of God as God's way of winning victory over evil. The death of Jesus, as well as the death of those who witness to him, will be God's way of triumphing over evil and inaugurating the eschaton. Again, Kester is exceptionally lucid. Revelation will carry the martyr's question forward by returning to the heavenly altar at the seventh seal, where prayers continue to be offered. The martyrs ask how long God will delay in bringing justice, and the trumpet visions redefine the issue by disclosing why God delays. The trumpets bring plagues on earth without moving humanity to repent. The point is that if God responded to the martyrs' prayers by reducing his justice to wrath, then nothing would change. Therefore, the trumpet visions too are interrupted so that John can be commissioned to prophesy again. The sixth seal, cosmic dissolution, terror about the great day of their wrath. The sixth seal brings with it an explosion of cosmic reactions to the coming of God. These would have been perceived as omens of destruction broadly by various cultural traditions around the Mediterranean. The sun becomes black, the moon becomes like blood, stars fall from the sky itself rolls up like a scroll, and an earthquake displaces every mountain and island. This is total and utter global devastation. This is the first of many such images, which grow in magnitude and severity as the drama goes on, all displaying the signs of theophany. There's another cry from characters associated with this event, which raises the next crucial question. The cry comes from a crowd that spans the range of social strata, mentioning 7 groups: the kings of the earth, the nobles, the generals, the rich, the powerful, everyone, slave and free. 3 things should be noted here. One is the leveling function of this event. Everyone is now on the same footing, crying out and trying to hide from the threat. The second point is the irony displayed in this scene. Kester refers to the scene as satire. The final point is to make sense out of the image of cosmic dissolution, which provokes the terrified crowds to perceive the time as the wrath of the Lamb. The hierarchy of social status is leveled by the cosmic convulsion. Whether they are used to palatial luxury or the cramped filth of the tenement housing, everyone is now fleeing in terror. They are lumped together, now speaking with the same trembling voice, seeking solace in the ultimate equalizer, death. They call to the rocks to fall on them, to hide them from the coming of God and the Lamb. The irony is palpable. First, it is absurd that these people would attempt to find refuge in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, which have been displaced and are in danger of collapsing upon the refugees. The most ludicrous fact here is that this array of humanity would rather flee than to respond with repentance and contrition for the acts that have caused them to come under the peril of divine judgment. Second, the scene excoriates those characters who would typically be portrayed with honor and prestigious solemnity. Harry Meyer expresses the ridiculous imagery like this: with the opening of the sixth seal, the apocalypse modulates into burlesque. At first blush, the episode is a straightforward application of an Old Testament trope of the day of wrath or day of the Lord, depicting Yahweh's judgment as the advent of the day of punishment for sin. The day of wrath comes to the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the generals, and the rich, and the strong, and everyone, slave and free. The categorization expresses imperial hierarchy. The kings and great men hide in caves and urge the mountains to fall on them to save them from the face of him who is seated on the throne. John here replays the Older Testament military metaphor of conquering Yahweh. Their cry echoes the cry of despair of God's enemies in Hosea 10, before the coming of the Lord. But when we witness them hiding, additionally, from the wrath of the Lamb, the motif moves from an emphasis on Yahweh's righteous judgment of sin toward the parodic incongruity of mighty generals fleeing in terror from a lamb. The introduction of this unlikely character to an otherwise traditional metaphor of a conquering God draws both the Older Testament motif and the response of the judged into an ironical play of incongruity that the apocalypse nowhere attempts to resolve. His is a parody of power and might. Finally, we can take note here of the images of cosmic collapse. We recall from considering the Olivet discourse above that Jesus employed images of cosmic dissolution to describe the devastating loss of the Jerusalem temple in Mark 13:24-26. The most poetic commentary comes from Resegwe. He writes, "This is standard apocalyptic language for an end-time scenario. The splitting of the earth is a visible sign that the present world order is irreparably fractured. The political order cannot resist God's order, and so the earth's quaking is symbolic of the fissures of a world order that elevates human institutions and earthly powers over God. The sun clothes itself with black goat hair as the mourning sign of the spiritual and moral decay of the world. The moon turns from its natural warm glow to an unnatural blood red, emblematic of an inverted, upside-down, carnival-type world that dissolves into utter chaos. Cosmic dissolution is a metaphor for the moral, spiritual, and physical dissolution of the earth. Corruption on earth is accompanied by the weakening and displacement of heavenly bodies. With the cosmos out of joint and with everything from humankind to heavenly bodies out of kilter, a messianic repair is urgently needed. No segment of society is absolved from the cosmic collapse, for at one time or other all have participated in creation's descent to decay and chaos. For those who embrace Babylon's norms, values, and beliefs, a world that is passing away, the Lamb's victory is experienced as wrath. The cosmic battle between evil and good and between the old order and the new order requires a complete overhaul of creation. The second creation, rightly ordered and properly anchored in God, replaces the chaos and disorder of the creation. It's important for us to recognize that the claim that this event portrays wrath is from the perception of the fearful inhabitants of the earth. We should not too quickly assimilate this image of cosmic disintegration into some kind of doctrine of the wrath of God. That is, this says more about the state of human obstinacy than it does about divine action. Kester notes, "Those who oppose the Lamb will experience his coming as a threat. What they do not see is that the Lamb who threatens the current order can also redeem those of every tribe, people, nation, and language." All of this culminates in the question reverberating throughout the rumbling of rocks and knocking of knees: who is able to stand? The spectators, who are trembling at the signs of God's coming, call out in terror at the prospect of the arrival of God and the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Therefore, when we arrive at the awestruck wonder of the crowds before the apparent splendor and strength of the beast in Revelation chapter 13, verse 4, they ask the question, who is like the beast and who can fight against it? We can merely smirk. They will change their tune when the end finally arrives. However, even before we arrive at that ironic scene, we receive an answer to this question in the form of a contrasting vision of the redeemed. Again, a contrast between what is heard in an announcement with what is actually seen in John's vision. The Interlude, the seal of the living God, Revelation 7, 1-17. There's a pleasant surprise in this interlude. One might expect that the answer to the question, who is able to stand, would be nobody. There's no one who could possibly stand before the coming of such an awesome and powerful God, whose very presence causes the heavenly bodies to disperse and the earth to shatter, right? In fact, there is. When John is allowed to see the redeemed, he finds a countless multitude of people who can stand before God, not by their social positions, but because they have been cleansed by the Lamb. Rather than closing off the future, the contrasting visions open up a way of seeing the future in which persistent opposition to God and the Lamb bring the threat of judgment, while sacrifice of the Lamb extends the promise of redemption. John shows that those who receive it, even kings, can hope for a place in the New Jerusalem. The interlude displays the redeemed people of God and shifts the tone from threat and warning to promise and comfort. In the immediate literary context, the scene in the interlude directly answers the question, who can stand? It will also prepare for the second great vision cycle where these characters introduced here engage in the combat with the beast. The first interlude, there will be a second after the 7 trumpets, also demonstrates for John's audience what is required if they want to participate in the heavenly worship for which creation exists and finds its fulfillment. Think back to Revelation 5, 11 through 14. What must they do? They must demonstrate allegiance to God and to the Lamb by persevering through the great tribulation. Reception of divine grace is verified by the patient endurance and is guaranteed to those who have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. 4 angels with 4 winds at the 4 corners of the earth. The interlude begins with a vision of 4 angels restraining the 4 winds that threaten to blow on the earth, sea, or tree, which have the power to damage the creation. An emerging contrast with the blackened sun comes with the image of an angel ascending from the rising sun. This angel has a seal, the same word used in Greek as the wax seals that would be on the scroll in 5:1, referring to a signet for stamping. That angel calls out to the 4 angels restraining the 4 winds which can damage the earth and says, "Do not damage the earth or the sea or the trees until we have marked the slaves of our God with a seal on their foreheads." This mark on the forehead will serve to identify those marked by the names of God and of the Lamb, and will serve to demarcate them so they will be protected from God's wrath when it is unleashed upon the earth. This seal from God will be mimicked by the beast in its parody of the Lamb in Revelation 13, verses 16 through 18, when it requires that all the inhabitants of the earth receive the mark of the beast on their forehead and their right hand in order to participate in economic commerce. The image of sealing or marking the forehead and the right hand is one that's common in the covenant relations of Israel. We can see this in 2 passages. First, in Deuteronomy 6, we see in the context of the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," in Deuteronomy 6:4, that the law is to be embodied, literally and symbolically embodied. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." This seems to represent the law governing both the head and the hands, that is, how one sees the world and how one acts in the world. The same notion seems to be presupposed in Jesus' hyperbolic demands in dealing with lust. "You've heard it said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into Gehenna. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into Gehenna." Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 30. Like in Deuteronomy, the eye and the hand seem to be poetic synecdoche to signify how one sees the world, that is, how one thinks and how one acts in the world. In the context of the apocalypse, this poses a strict oppositional alternative. Either one sees the world from God's perspective or from the vantage point of the dragon. Either one behaves in the world according to the ethos of the Lamb or of the beast. In the visionary world of the apocalypse, all people belong to God or his opponent. There is no neutral position. The census of the 144,000. John claims to hear the number of those who are sealed. It's a symbolic number that represents the totality of Israel, 144,000. There are 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, or so it is claimed. There are many peculiar features of this list of the 12 tribes here in Revelation. Most notably, in comparison with the other scriptural lists of the tribes, Judah is given prominent position and listed first. This is certainly a result of the Zionist messianic associations with the tribe of Judah. Second, there is the conspicuous absence of the tribe of Dan. That tribe has been replaced by Manasseh, it seems. It has been claimed that the absence of Dan is due to its association with idolatry, and perhaps because of a Jewish tradition that the Antichrist would come from the tribe of Dan. However, Richard Bauckham objects to that latter point, noting that there's no evidence of such a tradition before the Christian tradition of Irenaeus and Hippolytus. Finally, there is the mention of Joseph rather than Ephraim. The most conspicuous aspect of this list is that it evokes the calling of a census. And a census is taken primarily to take stock of able-bodied warriors. Therefore, the perfectly squared, audible arrangement of the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 times 12 times 1,000, evokes the imagery of military strength and ethnocentric patriotism. An innumerable redeemed multitude who have come out of the great tribulation. However, there's a correlating transformation in the imagery between what John hears and what John sees, as was the case in the heavenly throne room. It's Bauckham's great insight, and so we will allow his voice to come through. Chapter 7, verses 4 through 14, uses the same device as was used in chapter 5, verses 5 through 6, that of contrasting what John hears and what John sees. The 144,000 from the 12 tribes of Israel in 7:4 through 8 contrast with the innumerable multitude from all nations in 7:9. But the two images depict the same reality. They are parallel to the two contrasting images of Christ in 5 verses 5 through 6. The 144,000 Israelites are the followers of the Davidic Messiah, the Lion of Judah, while the innumerable multitude are the people of the slaughtered Lamb, ransomed from all nations. Just as the expectation of the Davidic Messiah was reinterpreted by means of the scriptural image of the Passover Lamb, so the purely nationalistic image of his followers is reinterpreted by an image drawn from the scriptural promises to the patriarchs. However, there's a further contrast between the 144,000 Israelites and the innumerable multitude which makes the parallel with 5 verses 5 through 6 exact. The 144,000 are an army. This is implicit in the fact that chapter 7 verses 4 through 8 is a census of the tribes of Israel. In the Old Testament, a census was always a reckoning of the military strength of the nation, in which only males of military age were counted. The 12 equal contingents of the 12 tribes are all the army of Israel, reunited in the last days according to the traditional eschatological hope, mustered under the leadership of the Lion of Judah to defeat the Gentile oppressors of Israel. But the multitude who celebrate their victory in heaven, ascribing it to God and the Lamb, have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. This means that they are the martyrs who have triumphed by participating through their own deaths in the sacrificial death of the Lamb. Thus, just as in 5 through 6 depicts Jesus Christ as the Messiah who has won the victory, but has done so by sacrificial death, not by military might, so 7:4 through 14 depicts his followers as the people of the Messiah who share in the victory, but do so similarly by sacrificial death rather than by military violence. Having rejected nationalistic militarism from his picture of the Messiah in 5 through 6, John is now equally rejecting it from his picture of the Messiah's followers, whose victory must be of the same kind as that as their leader. Thus, 7:9, as a reinterpretation of 7:4 through 8, indicates not so much the replacement of the national people of God as the abolition of its national limits. Bauckham goes even further to indicate the significance of this transformation of nationalistic and patriotic language in comparison with the lion imagery deployed in another apocalyptic work, 4 Ezra 11 through 13. We recall that in that text, the Messiah figure appeared as a lion who chastised and defeated the imperial eagle, who represented Rome. Bauckham comments, by comparison, Revelation makes lavish use of holy language, holy war language, while transferring its meaning to non-military means of triumph over evil. Human participation in the eschatological war is not rejected in Revelation, but emphasized and, again, depicted in terms drawn from traditions of holy war, which are then carefully reinterpreted in terms of faithful witness to the point of death. The distinctive feature of Revelation seems to be not its repudiation of apocalyptic militarism, but its lavish use of militaristic language in a non-militaristic sense. In the eschatological destruction of evil in Revelation, there's no place for armed violence, but there is ample space of the imagery of armed violence. No doubt, in the Jewish circles with which John and his churches had contact, including Jewish refugees from Palestine who joined the Jewish communities in the cities of Asia Minor after the fall of Jerusalem, ideas of eschatological holy war against Rome, such as the Qumran community had entertained and the Zealots espoused, were well known. Some Jews, disillusioned with such expectations after the fall of Jerusalem, may have joined the Christian churches to which John wrote. John's interaction with apocalyptic militancy will therefore have been part of his church's debate with the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews but are not, in Revelation 3:9. He is not concerned simply to repudiate apocalyptic militancy, since he shares much of its general outlook, a strong critique of Roman power as antithetical to the rule of God, a perception of religio-political issues with an eschatological and dualistic framework in which God and his people are in conflict with the satanic power and destined in the end to triumph, and a conviction of the need for God's people to engage in the conflict with evil by active resistance to the religio-political claims of Rome and pagan society. Therefore, instead of simply repudiating apocalyptic militancy, he reinterprets it in a Christian sense, taking up its reading of Old Testament prophecy into a specifically Christian reading of the Old Testament. He aims to show that the decisive battle in God's eschatological holy war against all evil, including the power of Rome, has already been won by the faithful witness and the sacrificial death of Jesus. Christians are called to participate in his holy war and his victory, but by the same means as he employed, bearing the witness of Jesus to the point of martyrdom. It is misleading to describe this as passive resistance. For John, it is as active as any physical warfare, and his use of holy war imagery conveys this need for active engagement in the Lamb's war. Part of the aim of the book of Revelation is to alert the readers to the fact that what is going on around them in the social and political life of their own cities is part of a conflict of cosmic proportions, the eschatological war of good and evil, the conflict of sovereignty between God and the devil, in which they are called to take sides, to take a firm stand, and by faithful witness to the truth to play their part in resisting the pagan state in society. The message is not, do not resist, so much as resist, but by witness and suffering, not by violence. The active metaphor of warfare serves this purpose better than the language of passive resistance. John's apocalyptic imagery achieves a symbolic transformation of the world. That is, it changes his readers' perception of the situation in which they live, and so enables them to behave differently in response to it. The imagery of holy war provides a most effective vehicle for this purpose because it highlights the issue. When the beast puts the martyrs to death, who is the real victor? The sheer political and military power of the beast seems divine, and this earthly view of the power situation was surely one which Christians themselves were tempted to share. They were a tiny minority of powerless people confronted with the apparently irresistible might of the Roman state and the overwhelming pressure of pagan society. To refuse to compromise was simply to become even more helpless victims. The apocalyptic visions, however, reveal that from a heavenly perspective, things look quite different. From the perspective, the martyrs are the real victors. To be faithful in bearing the witness of Jesus, even to the point of death, is not to become a helpless victim of the beast, but to take the field against him and win. The massive, innumerable crowd, dressed in white robes, like the 24 elders, with palm branches in their hands, this is clearly the garb and accessories of a festal celebration. They now have the ultimate privilege of standing before the throne and the Lamb, and they exclaim, "Salvation belongs to our God, who is seated on the throne, and to the Lamb." And then they join the worshiping collective in the company of angels, the elders, the four living creatures, and together they all bow down before God and sing, "Amen! Blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever. Amen." One of the elders turns to John and inquires about the identity of these new members of the heavenly entourage. John defers back to the elder, who explains and exclaims in a poetic hymn celebrating their salvation. He says, "These are they who have come out of the great ordeal, the great tribulation. They've washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. For this reason they are before the throne of God, and worship him day and night within his temple. And the one who is seated on the throne will shelter them. They will hunger no more, and thirst no more. The sun will not strike them, nor any scorching heat, for the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of water of life, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." Revelation 7:14 through 17. That they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb, Resegwe comments, "The imagery of Christians washing their robes in the Lamb's blood is symbolic of their alignment with the cause of Christ. Although the Lamb's blood cleans their robes, the saints play an active role by following the way of the Lamb." The language of this poem anticipates the experience of the New Jerusalem in Revelation chapters 21 and 22. The vision brings us again to what could be a fitting end to the work. This paradoxical vision takes readers into a world where a specific number refers to a crowd that is numberless, where blood makes clothing white, and where a lamb acts as a shepherd. However, the final seal has not yet been broken, and so the drama carries on. The seventh seal, silence in heaven and incense from the altar. The breaking of the seventh seal is both a conclusion to these visions and an introduction to the next septet. Therefore, 8:1 through 5 is a transitional interlocking passage. Three aspects are associated with the breaking of the seventh seal: a period of silence in heaven, the introduction of the seven angels with seven trumpets, and the casting of fire from the altar in heaven down to the earth. Silence for half an hour. Revelation is not just a visually stunning book for the imagination, it is also a very loud book. There's singing and crying aloud and calling out and praise and rumblings of earthquakes and yellings and voices that sound like trumpets. Therefore, the silence that comes with the breaking of the seventh seal is much like a stunned hush that falls over a crowd waiting with bated breath for the next movement. It is shocking that the praise of heaven that rings out day and night has come to a halt. Suspense is heightened, and through this moment of contemplation, we gather our thoughts and become prepared for what is next. We can take stock of the two driving questions: how long and who is able to stand? The second question has already been answered. Those who have come through the great tribulation and who have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb, they can stand. And even stand before the throne of God and the Lamb. Now we can anticipate the more complete answer to the first question. A little longer was the preliminary answer, but now we will receive a glimpse into the mysterious reasoning of God and why God delays in bringing justice and vindication. The silence may have another function. David Barr suggests that silence may signal a new world order. He draws a comparison with 4 Ezra, reading from chapter 7. For behold, the time will come when the signs which I have foretold to you will come, and the city which is now seen shall appear, and the land which now is hidden shall be disclosed. And everyone who has been delivered from the evils that I have foretold shall see my wonders. For my Messiah shall be revealed with those who are with him, and he shall make rejoice those who remain for 400 years. And after these years my Son, the Messiah, shall die, and all who draw human breath, and the world shall be turned back to primeval silence for 7 days, as it was at the first beginning, so that no one shall be left. And after 7 days the world which is not yet awake shall be roused, and that which is corruptible shall perish, and the earth shall give back those who are asleep in it, and the dust those who rest in it, and the treasury shall give up the souls which have been committed to them, and the Most High shall be revealed on the seat of judgment, and compassion shall pass away, mercy shall be made distant, and patience shall be withdrawn, but only judgment shall remain. Truth shall stand, and faithfulness shall grow strong, and recompense shall follow, and reward shall be manifested, and righteous deeds shall awake, and the unrighteous deeds shall not sleep. There's much to ponder here. We note there is an image of some kind of recapitulatory recurrence, the creation or return to a primal state of purity, lacking corruption. However, the period of silence there is a complete period of 7 days. In Revelation, it is an incomplete period, only half an hour. It is a preparation for what comes next, a kind of refusal to hand the drama over to denouement or conclusion. There are still questions to be answered, and there is still a divine reckoning that needs to take place in the apocalypse. Incense from the altar. The preparation for this reckoning returns us to the altar. An angel arrives with a censer, into which he fills a great quantity of incense to offer with the prayers of the saints. The incense, along with the prayers of the saints, rises before God who sits on the throne. We are reminded of the prayer, "How long?" The angel takes fire from the altar to fill the censer and throws it to the earth. Before, with the breaking of the 6th seal, there was a great earthquake. This activity of heaven has a similar but intensified effect on the earth. Now there are peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. The overlapping and intensifying imagery allows us to pick up where we left off, in a sense, before the interruption of the interlude. There's a renewed sense of urgency and expectation for a powerful coming of God and of the Lamb. The God who was made known at Mount Sinai is about to act in a new exodus for a new deliverance and another judgment upon powers and authorities that oppress God's creation and corrupt the creational order with idolatrous and violent disorder. Our conclusion. We are prepared now to experience the second numbered septet, the blowing of the 7 trumpets. We are armed with the assurance of the identity of those who are able to stand in the great day of God's coming. Furthermore, we as the audience are eagerly anticipating the fuller answer to the question of how long. We have a clear vision of who reigns sovereign and supreme, and a surprising but satisfying vision of precisely how that reign is exerted, supremely through the paradigm of the slaughtered yet standing lamb, and the replication of that pattern in the faithful witnesses who continue to bear testimony to the salvation which belongs only to God who is seated on the throne and to the Lamb. There are still many surprises to come and further clarifications of how the grand vision of heavenly throne room and the ensuing drama of the hoofbeats of history will play out as John's vision strings us along toward the fulfillment and the grand promises of salvation and judgment.